Hello, everyone. You're watching the 2024 Emerging Trends webinar. And our next guest is Scott Gerard, the founder and CEO of Knowledge Reactor AI. How are you doing today, Scott?
I'm really good. Really looking forward to 2024.
So are we, and I'm sure our audience is as well. And Scott, one of the biggest trends that we're seeing for the year ahead is artificial intelligence. How could we ignore this huge trend that's happening across pretty much every industry? And so, can you tell the audience briefly the difference between AI and ML?
Absolutely. A lot of people confuse them and suggest that they're the same thing, but they're not. The same thing, but they're not. AI is the absolute biggest piece of this pie here. It includes all stuff in it. Um, Automated reasoning like theorem proving, knowledge graphs, planning problems, all kinds of things are part of artificial intelligence. Machine learning is just one subfield of artificial intelligence. I like to think of it as the difference between science is to mathematics in the same way that artificial intelligence is to machine learning. Mathematics helps all of the sciences, and all of the sciences use mathematics. And the same thing with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is dealing with things that are more kind of like use cases, but machine learning is helping all of those people work with it. So that's part of the difference. But there's also some other subcategories of machine learning that I think people are also confusing. Within machine learning, there's deep learning, which is let's use neural networks and lots of layers. That's where the deep comes from. But even within that is where generative AI comes in. It's of uh, one kind of deep learning. And within the generative AI, you've kind of got here's the large language models. That's one kind of thing. And what that's doing is it's generating text, and then the generative art is kind of the other one, and that's generating images and videos and that kind of thing. So there's a whole range and whole hierarchy of terms that are involved here that are not the same. Unfortunately, people use them interchangeably, and they shouldn't.
Thank you so much, Scott. And I love the analogy that you provided us. So, thank you for that. And next, let's talk about you already described a little bit about the relationships between AI, ML, deep learning, generative AI, large language models, and even generative art. But there's also AIoT. So, what makes AIoT different? And if there's anything else you wanted to mention about the relationships between the other terms, please feel free to fill us in.
Absolutely. Um, of course, there are some obvious big differences between IoT things, right? They're often power constrained, memory constrained, CPU constrained. Um, they often have private data on them, but those devices aren't in secured access controlled rooms, right? So people can steal them and then suck data off of them. They can fool around with them while they're still connected. Those are kind of some of the obvious differences. But what I like to think of in addition is what I call the five V's. So, what is the volume of the data that your IoT device is working with? You can have IoT tends to have really high volumes of data because it's we're generating the data, we're capturing the data automatically. So, like an extreme example is a jet engine. They're generating gigabytes and terabytes of data just for one engine. So volume is one thing that is often different about IoT and AIoT. The second V is velocity. How quickly is the data coming? Well, it's coming a lot more. It's because we can do it automatically, it's coming every 10 milliseconds, every 1 millisecond, maybe faster, maybe slower. But think about the velocity that the data is coming in. You've got to be able to process the data at the speed that it's coming in. The third V is veracity. And again, because we have machines collecting this data, the data itself usually is quite truthful. That's what veracity means. It's way more truthful than social media posts generated by humans, right? So we often have very high quality data. The fourth one is variety. And now it's not that so much it's different for IoT, but there are some differences here. If you're doing weather data or something like that, it's structured data. You've got temperature, pressure, humidity, dew point, things like that. Fits into a spreadsheet really well. A lot of IoT is structured data, but there are other IoT devices that aren't. Things like audio, things like image data for security systems. A lot of that is very different kinds of data, and those different kinds of variety need to be handled by different kinds of algorithms to extract the information for it. But the one that I like the best is the fifth V, and I call that venues. The Internet of Things is the Internet of Things, but I think we could replace the I with interconnected and have essentially the same idea. But that means there's at least two devices here. In practice, there's often many devices involved. So what we're talking about is a distributed system. And that's all the way from the device edge to the on-premise edge. Sometimes with 5G, we can have multiple venues in the telco system, and then finally up to the cloud would be yet another venue. So there's a lot of venues where we can put our computing and have them work together. But that's going to involve the distributed systems. Now the bad news is distributed systems are harder to design and to debug and everything else than monolithic systems. But the good news is that gives us some incredible flexibility. The thing that I like is if you're trying to send data from a device and you've got a lot of volume and a lot of velocity and it's coming up really quick, with with these various venues, we can abridge the data. There's some data that doesn't need to get past the higher levels, and we can just delete that data. Some of them, we can condense the data, consolidate the data, and focus really on only the most important pieces of the data, and that's all we send up. And why is that useful? Because we can reduce bandwidth, which reduce costs, and also it will typically reduce latency as well. So AIoT is different than many other kinds of artificial intelligence.
Wow, Scott, that was very well said. Thank you so much for explaining that to us. And I really see that with everything that you described in these five V's, that it's really going to enable the scalability that we've not seen quite yet with the Internet of Things that maybe people were expecting. So with AIoT, we'll be able to do more with the data because for so many use cases, they're collecting all this data and it's pretty useless unless it's doing some kind of trigger alert. So I think that, what we'll be able to see with what AI can provide as to the different variations and everything else that you mentioned that goes along with AI, that it can see these tiny changes and really make the assumptions and really stand out what needs to stand out within the data. So thank you for that, Scott. And what kind of new skills are going to be needed for AIoT?
Well, to build an IoT device itself, I mean, I think the audience pretty well understands that, but there's a lot of technologies that need to go into just building the device. Power engineering, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, network engineering. The list goes on and on and on. But the audience probably understands that. But that's just getting the data from the sensor or sensors up to some compute platform where we can do something with it. And now we have to try to figure out what the insights are. How can we extract that insights from that data? And artificial intelligence and machine learning are kind of the leading edge ideas for how to extract maximal value from that data. But that's going to require another set of skills. That's AI architectures, machine learning, deep learning, model deployments, model monitoring. There's a lot of things that just kind of go into this AI bucket, this machine learning bucket. And of course, they're different. Um, but the other thing that a lot of people probably haven't thought about in the last 5 or 10 years, people are more interested now in trustworthy AI. It's not just that I can recognize a face, but can I recognize all faces the same? Does the color of the skin matter in how well I can do that. So ethical AI, trustworthy AI is becoming much more important. Not every IoT device needs to do that, but many are. And there's a lot of pillars under that. Is it ethical? Is it fair? Is it biased? Is it explainable? Are you taking care and keeping the data private? So there's a lot of skills that are kind of coming to the fore that need to be incorporated in pieces with some of these devices.
Thank you, Scott. You're clearly an expert on this subject matter. So, what do you see for 2024?
Let me make a completely obvious prediction. Generative AI will be really important in 2024. No one has any surprises about that, I think. But the non obvious one is there was everybody and their dog was claiming to be a generative AI person in 2023. I don't think all of those are going to survive in 2024. There will be some level of consolidation around that. Some of the things that people had, I think, are going to kind of fade away into the background. It will still be hugely important. I'm not saying that it won't. But the other piece is that I think a lot of people are saying generative AI is this magic potion that's going to solve all of my problems. It can do amazing things, but it also hallucinates. It just makes up stuff and says very confidently, here's something that's, the sky is green. Well, it's not green, right? A lot of people aren't thinking about the hallucinations that these large language models can make. And they do make them. Regardless of all the guardrails you put on them, they're still going to make mistakes. So I would just encourage people to think about that and make sure that if you're in a high risk use case, you need to think about what will happen to me if my model hallucinates. Is it to my employees that know better and they can filter things out, or am I going to my clients and I'm giving them bad information? What are the reputational damages? What are the financial damages? What are the legal damages? I think people need to be a little more careful about looking at the good and the bad.
Wow, it's got a lot to take in there. So, hopefully, our audience can take away a lot from our conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I look very forward to having you on a future edition of our live events and our Industry Insights webinar series. Thanks so much, Scott.
Thank you so much, Tiffany.
Bye bye.